much again for being here on Saturday. It's so great to see you. I think a lot of the focus of this is really solutions, and we were lucky enough to have a representative from FEMA last year, and this year Kate Ryan is here. It's really great that she actually has expertise in historic preservation, so she understands not only the physical resiliency needed to protect existing structures, but also the social aspects to them, and why it's so important to really start to begin to think about how are we going to save our historic districts, existing buildings, and how that really relates to sustainability and resiliency as a community. Kate is an environmental protection specialist for FEMA. She reviews hazard mitigation assistance projects for compliance with environmental and historic preservation laws. Prior to joining FEMA, she served as the Director of Preservation at the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation and worked as an archaeologist on projects throughout Georgia. She has a BFA and MA in Historic Preservation from Savannah College of Art and Design, and she currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. And today she's going to be talking to us specifically about preserving heritage before, during, and after disasters. So if you could welcome her up here.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me. We'll start off by saying that I've been with FEMA for about 3 years. When I started with FEMA, I will admit that I was generally ignorant to what FEMA actually does. And I'm going to go through some slides and I'll give you the official definitions of things. But it took me a while, even after working for FEMA for a number of months, going through on-training, doing a lot of training, to really see what all that FEMA does. And I think I'm still exploring and learning all that FEMA does. So a little bit of background on FEMA. We just celebrated our 40th birthday. We were started on April 1st in 1979. And we are not emergency responders, so we don't go out when the emergency hits and boots on the ground save people. We are more the emergency response coordinators. We forward deploy ahead of storm events, and we're there to help coordinate the response to emergencies. We also do a heck of a lot of planning and mitigation. So we have a planning department that works with states and communities to put together hazard mitigation plans. And then we have I primarily work in our hazard mitigation assistance program to help communities be better prepared and more resilient for events. So today I'll talk a little bit about what FEMA's vision is and strategic plan, what environmental planning and historic preservation, which is where I work, EHP, what our mission is and what we do, our EHP compliance reviews, the National Historic Preservation Act and the Section 106 process, how we identify historic properties, undertakings, and effects, and we'll go through a couple of case studies to show how this actually works. So FEMA's mission is helping people before, during, and after disasters. I come from Region 4. We have 10 regions throughout the country. Region 4 is generally the southeast region. So it's Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. It is the largest region in our nation. We also include 6 Native American tribes. And something interesting about that is that those are 6 Native American tribes that have reservation land within our region. However, when we consult on projects, when we're working on projects, we consult with tribes in addition to those 6. And those are any tribes that have ancestral land in the southeast. So we know that tribes were removed from parts of our nation to other parts of our nation. But there are archaeological remains in our region, and those tribes that are no longer living there also have an interest in that. FEMA's strategic plan for 2018 through 2020, we have 3 main goals: build a culture of preparedness, ready the nature for catastrophic disasters, and reduce the complexity of FEMA. So under build a culture of preparedness is where we really talk about those mitigation efforts. How can we be better prepared to handle an event that may be coming? Readying the nation for a catastrophic disaster, not just mitigation, but also what is the response locally? How do we respond to those disasters? And then reducing complexity of FEMA. We're always looking for ways that we can streamline our response. And one of the things that we're working on specifically in Florida is we have a memorandum of agreement with the state of Florida, where Florida is an enhanced state, and they're handling more of the review process themselves when they submit applications for mitigation grants, in an effort to streamline and make that grant application process go a little bit quicker. And then we do have some moonshots. So our moonshots, which align with our strategic plan goals. Our strategic objective 1.1 is incentivize investments that reduce risk, including pre-disaster mitigation and reduce disaster costs at all levels. And that is to increase our investment in mitigation 4 times. So when we talk about those mitigation assistance grants, we have 3 primary mitigation grants that we offer. Flood mitigation assistance grants and the pre-disaster mitigation grants. And those are offered on an annual basis. And then we have hazard mitigation grant program, which is a money that it comes from when there is a declared disaster within a state. A portion of that money is made available to the entire state to apply for grants to make their communities more resilient to future events. We also have our strategic objective 1.2 is to close the insurance gap. FEMA underwrites all flood insurance, the National Flood Insurance Program, and the goal is to double the coverage by 2023. Region 4 does have the highest number of insured properties. And then when we talk about mitigation, what we're looking at is, or what studies have shown is that we're getting a 6-to-1 return on investment when we put the money forward into mitigation. So we see that as a real positive. That's some numbers that came out after a study in the end of 2017 that increased that. So we see that when we invest in mitigation, we really are investing well and helping communities at a really great rate. So one of the big things that I know something the commissioner talked about is flooding. Flooding is our #1 response that we see. When we have an event, flooding is catastrophic. So anywhere it can rain, it can flood. Whether you're in the floodplain or out of the floodplain, you're still susceptible to flooding. We do see risks in Florida. Of course, you have had several hurricanes. When Irma was wind and rain event, when we saw Michael came through, it came through fast and powerful, and it was largely a wind event. So we see that the risks are changing and evolving. We also see that the populations are changing, where people are living are changing, where people want to live. So taking all of that into consideration, when we look at how are we really best helping our communities, and how are we helping those to protect the history that's there and the communities that are there that help make up the history. And that's where EHP could come into play. So the Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation Division for FEMA is EHP. We integrate the protection and enhancement of environmental, historic, and cultural resources into FEMA's mission. We ensure that FEMA's activities comply with federal environmental and historic preservation laws and executive orders, and we provide technical assistance. Before I started with FEMA, and I would see that there were off-the-job listings looking for historic preservation professionals to join FEMA, and I really couldn't wrap my head around why FEMA needed historic preservation professionals. And then it dawned on me that, well, if storms are coming and we're affecting communities, it's not just the response, what happens if a historic building is lost, but what can we do to be better prepared so that historic building isn't lost when a storm comes? Or if it is lost, then we have documentation, we have record of it. So it became a really important learning experience for myself, somebody who had been in the field for a number of years, but had never really thought about the effects of those natural disasters or man-made disasters, unfortunately, that can really affect our communities and our buildings. And EHP is involved with the entire life cycle of a FEMA program. So whether it's an event that happens or if it's grants that we're giving, EHP is involved throughout the entire experience. And when you look at the far left side where we have the preparedness and ongoing planning, EHP is involved with that planning, review of those applications that come in for grants, awarding the grants, and working through the grant process to make sure that preservation is part of the equation. Then where that red lines are, that's where we have an event that happens. We have the initial response to the event, and that's within the first couple of days. Sometimes when we have hurricanes and we know that the storm is coming, we will forward deploy and we start our preparation ahead of the event. We open up a JFO, which is the Joint Field Office. Usually that's in a large existing building, think like a mall that maybe has closed down, a Walmart that's gone out of business. We will look to lease a space like that and set up a temporary office. We work with other agencies. We do mission assignments, so like I said, we're not going out and cutting trees and moving debris, but we're working with the Corps of Engineers and the forestry agencies to mission assign that work, to cut debris, clear the roads. That's usually our first response, so that we know that those emergency vehicles can get through and get to where they need to go. Things like getting ice and water to people, setting up locations where residents that are without electricity can come and get water, get ice, get the supplies they need. Those are all happening within the very first couple of days after a large event. Then we start getting the reports about damages. We go out and we do inspections, we see what damages are there, we talk with the community about what their priorities are for making repairs, and we start working through that process where we fund those repairs, and those repairs are back to pre-disaster condition. So generally we're not changing much, so as far as the historic preservation goes, it's something that we review and we consult on, but it's generally not an issue because we're going back to how things work. And then we have mitigation, where we may be changing things to make buildings, to make roads, drainage, facilities more resilient. And when we start changing things, we look at, are we changing anything that might be historic, and how are we changing that? So that goes on throughout the entire life cycle, and then it starts all over again. We generally have two programs that EHP supports, and that's our public assistance program and our hazard mitigation assistance program. So for public assistance, it provides grants so that communities can quickly respond to and recover from major disasters or emergencies. And then in hazard mitigation, it provides grants in support of sustainable actions taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people, property, and property for future disasters. And what's important with both of these is that we're providing grants. So FEMA, again, we're not going out and doing the work, but we're providing grants. We're a funding agency. And it's also important to note that we have mitigation throughout the entire life cycle. An event hits, we have response and recovery, and then we mitigate to try and make ourselves more resilient for future events, and knowing that the next event is just around the corner. There are some inherent tensions that exist when we talk about preservation and resiliency. So what are we willing to sacrifice, and what matters as we look at the real issues of future risk? For historic preservation, the National Historic Preservation Act, which we'll talk about in a minute here, we're not required to preserve or save the building. What we're required to do is consider what our effects may be. And then we have local priorities and state priorities. Are the priorities leading in one direction or another? And how do the different perspectives become part of the dialogue? So dialogue is what it's all about. With the National Historic Preservation Act, it's all about consultation, involving different partners, and trying to reach a goal that is best for the community, and that everybody can be in agreement with that. For Region 4, our environmental compliance reviews, a compliance review is triggered by funding of eligible projects that are proposed by states and tribes. So a state will apply to FEMA for funding, and that may be on behalf of a local community. Or a tribe following Hurricane Sandy and the Sandy Response Act, a tribe as a sovereign nation can apply for funding for themselves. Our compliance reviews are process-driven, and there's no guarantee that a natural or historic resource will be protected. It is a guarantee that it will be considered and that we'll look at all different possible approaches to saving what we can, but it is not a guarantee. It does require consultation, and that we consult to find ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate adverse effects. And to put it into numbers, in 2018, our region alone reviewed 14,924 grant projects for environmental and historic consideration. Of that, 8,640 were in Florida alone, and that broke down to 8,194 PA or public assistance grants and 282 hazard mitigation grants. We also have some grants that we provide through our national security grant program, and there were some in Florida that received that grant money. We do anticipate, just from Irma alone, over 2,000 public assistance projects, and in excess of 500 hazard mitigation grant projects from Irma, and then, of course, the new one as well. And so when we're talking about those reviews, there are a number of different laws and executive orders that we review projects for. Our 5 big ones are NHPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act, ESA, Endangered Species Act, Executive Order 11988 and Executive Order 11990, with EO 11988 being the effects on floodplains, and EO 11990 the effects on wetlands. So those are our five big ones, as we call them, that really are laws and executive orders that require the most in-depth look when we're reviewing a project. National Historic Preservation Act happens to be my favorite. It came around in 1966, and it requires that, or it directs federal agencies to take into account the effect of any undertaking, which is a federally funded or assisted project, on historic properties. So again, FEMA funds. So anytime that we are funding a project, we're looking to see if that project that we're funding will have an effect on historic property. when federal engagement occurs, consideration for historic properties are under National Historic Preservation Act happens. And there's a process for this, and that's called the Section 106 process. But basically, we look to see if there is an undertaking that requires a review, and then we can consult and coordinate with other groups that may be interested. That review process does not prevent construction or require preservation. However, it does require us to look at ways that we can avoid, minimize, or compensate historic properties for the effect of the project. It takes coordination and communication with stakeholders throughout the entire process to develop a plan for that approach. And that communication and consultation is really our main goal there. So the first step in that Section 106 process, and this is overseen by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, is when you initiate the process is to determine if you have an undertaking and what that undertaking is. Next, you identify if you have a historic property and what those historic properties are that may be affected. Then we look at what is the effect. Is it going to be an adverse effect to that historic property, or is it just going to affect the historic property but not in an adverse way? And then we look to resolve that adverse effect if in fact we do have one. And when we look at resolving the adverse effect, it doesn't mean that it cannot happen. It just means that there has to be a resolution to it. So the types of undertakings that we typically see with FEMA are repairs to buildings, roads, and utilities following an event, debris clearing and staging. So we do have concerns with that, primarily with the staging, because we generally stage in an open field, but we're going to have heavy machinery that will be bringing in that debris. So will that be affecting the ground, and are we potentially affecting archaeological remains? Logistics and leasing, again, when we're renting buildings to stage our offices, we look at what our effects may be if those buildings have to be historic. We do have some new construction that we fund. Primarily, that would be storm shelters. We retrofit buildings to make them more resilient to storms. And then we also do fund projects for residential properties, and that may be elevating, reconstruction, or demolition. And so really anything that we do, we have an undertaking, and we need to identify what our effects may be. So we are identifying next if we have a historic property, and we look at the criteria that's been established for the National Register for Historic Places. There's 4 criteria that we look at. And we want to see if the building or the property has both significance and integrity. So first criteria would be if it's associated with an event that's historic or significant. Next, we would see if the property is associated with a significant person. And then, this is something probably that we would see more in Miami, is are there distinctive characteristics of a type, period, method of construction, something that represents the work of a master, the process, or possess a high artistic value, represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction, but as a whole would be significant. So that's what we're looking at, like a historic district. And then the last criterion, D, is yielded or may likely yield information according to history or prehistory. And that one generally is what we look at for if there are any archaeological concerns. So first, we receive a project. We look at, do we have an undertaking? Yes, because we're going to fund this project. And then, are there any historic properties there? So when we're looking for historic properties, we're looking at, we look back at photographs, we try to research properties as best we can. These are just a few photos I pulled from of some historic flooding events. Again, flooding tends to be our primary event that we respond to, and so when we're looking at that, we're seeing what kind of history do we have with flooding, and is this a repetitive flood loss area? So that will help inform how we determine our response to this. And some of these, when we're looking at residential structures, it may be obvious if something is old, as we may think, okay, that's old, that may potentially be historic. But then we have some other properties from more recent past, stuff that we're used to seeing and growing up with, which we may not necessarily think is historic off the bat, but when we look closer to it, it could be really telling us a lot about how we lived and how we developed our communities. So one of the things that we see quite often with FEMA is our communities that developed post-World War II, we had a baby boom. People were coming back from the war, the GI Bill was helping to fund house purchases, and there was a need for affordable housing. There was common that there was affordable land to be developed that had not previously been developed because it was in a floodplain. So we see a lot of housing stock from the 40s, 50s that were developed in a floodplain. They're moderate income housing, and they flood repetitively. It tells us a lot about our history and our society, how those neighborhoods developed. They probably never should have been built where they were, and now, how do we evaluate that? Do we keep those communities intact? Do we keep that housing? Or do we recognize that if we do keep that there, we're continuing to keep people in harm's way, and maybe there's some other options? So that's something that we deal with a lot, and personally it's what I struggle with probably the most with the job, because I do want to see those communities and houses preserved, but recognize that it may not be the best for the community, for people's life and safety, and also, fiscally speaking, FEMA does make grants using taxpayers' money, so we need to evaluate that as well. So we look at those effects, and we look at the undertaking and try to see, is the effect going to be a no effect, where FEMA has worked with state historic preservation offices within our region, and in Florida we do have a programmatic agreement where we've worked out an agreement with the state that says identify certain undertakings that are very common for FEMA to have, and that generally result in no effect to a historic property. And we've agreed that when we have certain undertakings that meet certain guidelines, then the state has already agreed that it would not have effects, so we don't require additional consultation. And that would be something like installing a generator behind a building. Building was built 15 years ago, not in a historic district. We can all say that that most likely won't have an effect on anything historic. It does identify a historic property as anything that's 45 years or older. So, which may be a little bit different because when we look at the National Register, a rule of thumb is 50 years or older would be potentially qualified as historic. Frankly, FEMA grants can take a while to get processed and awarded, so we work in an extra 5-year buffer there because we may consult on a project 1 year and it's 47 years old, but by the time that grant's awarded, it may be 51 years old. So we use 45 as our reference point. Anything over 45 years old, we consult with the State Historic Preservation Office. We do make a determination of effect, though, whether we think that our project will have an effect on that historic property, or whether it will have an effect but it's not an adverse effect, or if it will have an adverse effect. And then we look for ways that we would mitigate that. And when we mitigate our adverse effects, we have standard treatment measures that we've established with the State Historic Preservation Office. So in that programmatic agreement where we identify certain undertakings that would likely not have any effect. We've also identified ways that we would respond if we help. This could really help drive future preservation actions. Some standard treatment measures that we've identified are things like documentation and recordation of structures, a public interpretation program, a tribal treatment plan, historical context statements and narratives, oral histories and documentation, historic property inventory, and National Register nominations. So to give you an examples of that and how that can help, even if we have an adverse effect, we cannot save a building, unfortunately, because the building was affected by a storm and because of life and safety concerns, it had to be demolished immediately following that storm event. It couldn't be saved. When FEMA comes in to help fund that action, then we work with the community to identify what might be helpful to the community from a preservation standpoint that FEMA can fund. And so it may be identification of other historic buildings and getting those listed as National Register or doing an inventory of those and documentation so that if there were a future event that affects that building, we have documentation and we can help move forward with repairs to that. We do have a couple examples here of our projects. I tried to look for examples primarily from Florida. This one in particular is in Florida and it's on the Jungle Trail Historic District. It's a historic road. This is the only structure that contributes to that historic road district. And this is a 1921 bungalow. The county now owns this building and they are looking to put in a community center, a trailhead. They're going to be improving the trail as one of the recreational areas. So this building has repetitively flooded and they applied for a grant to elevate the building. The bungalow currently has a pier foundation that's 3.27 feet above, at that elevation of 3.27 feet. It's proposed to elevate the building an additional 4.73 feet, which would bring it to an elevation of 8 feet. And that's the base flood elevation for that area is 7 feet, and then there'd be 1 foot of freeboard. And then the proposed new foundation system was concrete padded piers. And we saw that this is a contributing structure to the National Register listed district. And so raising this building would be an adverse effect to it. And we reached that conclusion in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office. And we went back to the State Historic Preservation Office and said, we understand that as proposed, this would be an adverse effect. We have 2 options. Can we look at ways to elevate this property in order to save it from additional future flooding? Can we look at ways that we elevate it in a sensitive manner so that we avoid an adverse effect? Or we're going to elevate it exactly as proposed, and then we'll look at those standard treatment measures and say, we do have an adverse effect. Now what can we do to resolve that adverse effect? And we both agreed, we all agreed, that looking to elevate the property in a sensitive manner would be the best approach. And to do so, we looked at different design guidelines for elevation that have been established in other areas. So Mississippi and Louisiana both have some really great guidelines. They're both really similar to each other also. The Florida State Historic Preservation Office is currently working on their own elevation of historic property guidelines. And they recommended that we look to these as well. And when we looked at them, we saw things like elevating structures and here we have it. So elevating structures and then skirting piers. We proposed that the building would be elevated, but the piers, foundation piers would be surrounded in materials that match what are currently existing. adding some screening. So if we go back to the picture, unfortunately it's a little bit small, but you may be able to see that there's around the foundation there's an existing sort of vertical slats that are painted green. So we saw that as character-defining elements and suggested that be incorporated into the new design. So those vertical slats or some similar combination of other lattice would be included to skirt the new foundation. Also incorporating historic foundation plantings. So we did find a couple of historic pictures of this house from the 20s that showed plantings typical of the region that were around the foundation. Though they've been cleared now, we recommended that they come up with a historic planting plan. And then another thing that would significantly change is the approach to the house. When we're elevating the house an additional 4 feet, the front steps are going to be obviously higher, but also extended further. So keeping or looking to the existing material and handrails that exist on the front steps, and then mimicking that with the new steps that will be there. This particular project, though, it's not part of the FEMA grant because it'll be used for the public. It will also include ADA or Americans with Disability Act accessibility. So this will also have a ramp included to the house, and that will be put behind the house. So when we have buildings that are in a floodplain or have repetitive flood loss and are historic, they would, we look to keep people in the house and keep the community together and look at ways we may elevate the house. However, elevating the property may not always be the best choice. So we do see a lot of properties, and again, this tends to be those 1940s, 1950s neighborhoods where they've had repetitive flooding loss, and the residents have voluntarily decided to be bought out and have their houses demolished. Once the houses are demolished, then there is a deed restriction put on the property that the property can never be developed again. And it's returned to open green space and allows for the function of the floodplain to be restored. So this is a project in Jacksonville. And we have 22 properties which are represented by the little red dots on this map that are within the floodplain that have applied to be bought out. When we're looking at the flood map, the blue there is the 100-year floodplain, and the sort of orangey brown color is the 500-year floodplain, or the 1% and 0.2% chance annually of flooding. The neighborhood is not a listed historic district, but the city of Jacksonville has done a lot locally to identify historic districts. And I understand Miami has done the same thing. There are local historic districts that have been identified that may not necessarily be on the National Register, but they are locally designated. So Jacksonville had designated this as a historic district that is eligible for listing in the National Register. And these 22 properties all contribute to that historic district. So when we're looking at the historic, or looking at pictures of these houses, they may not necessarily stand out and hit you over the head as being, monumental historic properties, but this is really important to the development of Jacksonville and their history. So the district includes 519 historic structures, and they're primarily vernacular structures that masonry and wood frame forms, again representing development from that Great Depression to the time frame. This was really key to Jacksonville's development with affordable housing. So it was determined that demolition of these properties would obviously be an adverse effect to that historic district. So we've talked with local community, we've worked worked with the city and the state, and we identified that FEMA would use the following treatment measures to mitigate that adverse effect. We will record the subject properties, and then we're going to do a historic structure survey of a similar neighborhood nearby, so that, again, this would identify, hopefully will identify additional historic resources that if they are affected, then there would be some protection for them. We'll also do a public outreach program for the community about how you can flood-proof a historic property. I mentioned construction programs. So one of the primary grants projects that we fund that involve construction are building of community safe rooms. And this is a primary goal for the state of Alabama to increase their number of community and residential safe rooms. So was a safe room proposed for a vacant lot in the town of ONEONTA, Alabama. It was going to be a standard safe room, basically picked from a list of things approved by FEMA. It would be in compliance with code, FEMA and the International Construction Code for safe rooms. It consisted of precast, pre-assembled concrete, 14 feet high, 28 feet long, sort of just a concrete block in the middle of the historic district. When we consulted with the State Historic Preservation Office, they came back to us and said, well, this is not a National Register historic listed historic district. However, this is a historic downtown. And there's 3 blocks there of a commercial historic downtown, and this is the only vacant lot in that area. So we'd like to see a little bit more effort be put into the design. And so through this Section 106 process, it really offers us an opportunity to work with our interested parties and come up with ways that we can lessen what our effect may be to those historic resources. So the State Historic Preservation Office first recommended that some archaeology be done on the site because it is the only vacant lot where a historic building had been in that district. And then they made some design proposals. And those were things like the setback at height would conform with the what had been there, the demolished building that had been there, and that there'd be a brick facade put on the new storm shelter. It would look more like a historic commercial storefront than just a concrete block in the middle of the town. So we were able to work with the State Historic Preservation Office, again, recognizing that this would be a potential adverse effect to construct this building in the historic downtown. But there are ways to mitigate that so that we can make the building look a little bit more intact with what's already been established. And then when it comes to retrofitting a building, this could be really important to help us be more resilient and be better prepared for a storm. We do things like provide grant funding for adding high-impact glass to buildings, installing emergency generators, installing storm shelters, and strengthening roofs. This is the Champions Hall building in Florida. It's a senior center, but it's intended to be used as a storm shelter if there was an event in the community. The proposal was to update the windows and put in high-impact glass. So when we looked at the building, it's over 45 years old, but not quite 50 years old. It looked to be architecturally significant, and that the window design was character-defining. So we consulted with the State Historic Preservation Office because the building's older than 45 years old, and we pointed out in particular that the window glass would be changed to high-impact glass, and that the windows themselves are character-defining elements, but that the replacement of the glass itself without changing the shape or form of the windows would not adversely affect the building. So the SHPO actually responded that they didn't have any information about this building that would lead them to believe that the building itself was significant and historic. So we identified it as potentially historic, but that it lacked a degree of significance that would make it seen as potentially eligible for listing. So again, if we were to have had work in that community where we had a standard measure, it could have resulted in us going out and studying that building and that building potentially being identified and documented as potentially eligible for the National Register. Since that has not happened as of yet, the SHPO said you really don't have a historic property. You have an old property that's kind of cool looking, but it hasn't been designated as historic. And on top of that, we agree that changing the glass won't have an adverse effect. So all in all, we had a determination of no historic property affected and moved forward with the grant, but conditioned the grant that the shape and form of those windows can be altered just like that. And then is a project from South Carolina, the Beaufort National Landmark Historic District. They had applied for grants money to install hurricane storm shutters to protect these two buildings. On the left is the Beaufort Arsenal building, and on the right is the Carnegie Library. These buildings are right next to each other in Beaufort, and they contribute to the National Historic Landmark District. The proposal was for removable hurricane shutters. They would utilize pre-drilled holes and hand screws. All work would be done by hand, by trained staff. And the grant would include the purchase of a man lift to avoid having ladders that would be put up against the building. So their approach to the grant application was actually a really sensitive approach to begin with. Because this is a National Landmark Historic District, FEMA was required to consult not just with the State Historic Preservation Office, but also the National Park Service. And when we consulted with the National Park Service, they had additional concerns with what had been presented. Primarily, they were concerned with the weight of the shutters that would be installed. So ultimately, through consultation and about a year and a half of back and forth, we approved the grant application for removable fabric shutters, which we saw deployed in Charleston. I believe this is the Charleston City Hall, ahead of Hurricane Florence. So these fabric shutters are lightweight, but they also offer really great protection to those historic windows and are able to be installed sensitively, still using the hand screws and you can see here the lift as well. So we were able to reach a resolution to be able to fund that project and protect those buildings, but in a way that we really feel is most appropriate for the historic buildings. And then lastly, I wanted to show an example of a recent public assistance project that we've worked on because it includes a historic boat. And this historic boat that is called the Governor's Stone, and it is a National Historic Landmark. It was listed in 1991. So important to keep in mind that we're not just talking buildings when we talk about historic properties, also historic landscapes and different structures and elements as well. So unfortunately, the Governor's Stone, I'll give you a little bit of background about the Governor's Stone. It originally carried equipment and materials to deep draft ships offshore. It later operated as a oyster buy boat, and during Prohibition, it ran contraband rum shipments from Cuba. It capsized in the marina during Hurricane Michael. The marina required that all vessels were removed so that they could repair and restore their marina. And so there was a local private nonprofit that oversees the Governor's Stone, and it's the Friends of the Governor's Stone. So they applied for FEMA grant money through the Public Assistance Program in response to Hurricane Michael. This is what the poor Governor's Stone looked like following the storm. And so the Friends of the Governor's Stone, they hired a boat to lift the vessel out of the water, right it, and then it was taken on a trailer to a boatyard where it would be restored to pre-disaster condition. And they're able to apply to FEMA for funding for the expenses of lifting the boat out of the marina and transporting it. And again, it's key that the pre-disaster condition is what we look to, because that would be a restoration project, and there wouldn't be any changes to the vessel that would require any kind of additional consultation and consideration of the adverse effect. So there's our Governor's Stone out of the water, and as I understand, currently pending some restoration. So just to recap, we have events that happen that are unknown. So we're always looking to mitigation and planning beforehand. And then when the event happens, hopefully we're better prepared to respond and to withstand the event. We have a response to the recovery directly following that to recover from an event and repair back to our pre-disaster conditions. And then after that, we fund additional mitigation work where we see where vulnerabilities were during the event and look for ways that we can improve upon that going forward to be better prepared for the next event, which we know is just around the corner. And with that, I'll take any questions that anybody may have. Yes, ma'am.
I was interested in your discussion about the downtown where I don't know what agency wanted to put a big
The big safe
in the
room.
middle, safe place. We have, Miami Beach, as great as it looks, we have some problems too. And one of them that I have just heard is that Florida Power and Light wants to put a vault somewhere in the middle of the store thing. And I'm wondering, it's not, I don't believe it's on, it's a local district. But I don't think it's ever been added to the archive of the National Register. So I'm wondering, how much does FEMA look at these kind of things with public entities, not just safe space, at least that was for the reason they're doing it. Does FEMA look at things that happen to historic districts made by public entities?
Well, potentially, because FEMA would be involved if FEMA was funding the project at all. So if it was a public entity or if it was a utility company that was using FEMA for any type of funding, we would call it the $1 rule. If there's $1 of federal money being used, then there has to be a review as far as the historic property.
So that's like the 106?
Correct, yes, that would trigger the 106 process.
Yeah. How would a building, Little Miami Beach, they'd have to be involved, say that part of them? What do they have to be involved?
If there's any kind of FEMA funding that was involved. There may be other federal money there that's involved. And so anytime there is a federal undertaking, that causes the Section 106 process to be involved. So if it is a utility, there probably is some kind of federal money that's being involved. And so you may look at if there was permitting, possibly, that would be an undertaking as well. So you could look there, and then really the best defense for historic properties starts at the local level. So I understand there's local guidelines that are being developed, and there's a review board in Miami that reviews all projects. And so having that in place and strengthening that is really the best approach when we look at preservation issues. There's really only one law that can stop a project based on preservation, and that is the National Highways Law, and I believe it's 4F, and that says that if there is a highway undertaking that may affect a historic resource, they have to evaluate alternatives, and if an alternative exists that does not affect a historic resource, then Federal Highways Administration has to take that other option. So that's the only law that really says that a project has to avoid a historic resource if possible. All other projects, the law says that you have to consider historic properties that they affect, and then if you do have an adverse effect, you have to find a way to mitigate that effect.
So consider versus the.
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
So I had a question about hurricane impact windows, and in our Art Deco district, a lot of buildings still have like jalousie or awning windows, which aren't even original to, the original were like casement windows. But you mentioned the fabric shutters. Are those hurricane like impact? And if we put fabric shutters on our windows instead of replacing the windows, do you know if that is more cost effective as well?
Yeah, I don't know the numbers on pricing. I do know that for those two buildings, it was more cost effective to go with the fabric shutters, and it did have a lesser impact on the building. So it could be a really great approach. It's something I think would be worth looking into.
I know that the cost is not exponentially great. I've seen it used starting 15 or 20 years ago when you had inward opening doors. And instead, if you've got a historic door that opens in, which doesn't meet code, then those fabrics could be put on a portico and protect them. So that was some of the earliest applications of that. But
Could I just add to that conversation? Because Vizcaya's been using these for a couple of years, and they, in Irma, they found that some of the historic details of the building actually ripped the fabric because the building is more complex. And so as the wind moved, it moved across the fabric and tore the fabric, and therefore undermined its ability. So with historic buildings in particular, I think there are very special conditions to explore when using this type of fabric condition. It's not that it didn't work; it's just that it failed in certain critical conditions.
Sure.
And I'm not sure that they were really represented in the building you showed.
Yeah, these two buildings have pretty clean openings. Yeah. Sir? Yes?
Yeah, so I saw a lot of projects from all around the southeast, but I didn't see any projects from Miami Beach. So that kind of prompts my question: have there ever been any FEMA projects from Miami Beach, or have there ever been any grant applications from Miami Beach?
Good question. Yes, there have been. We don't have any at the moment that we're working on where I can pull some great examples, but there have been applications from Miami. We do have, actually, I mentioned that we have our security, Homeland Security Grants program, and that program has been very active in Miami because it provides security to synagogues in particular. And so several of the historic synagogues in Miami have applied for that grant program, and that's done things like install security gates and also cameras on buildings.
So you said Miami. Of course, we're in the city of Miami Beach, which is a separate city. So if I wanted, could I get a list of all of the FEMA projects where grant money has been allocated to the city of Miami Beach?
Yeah, but I believe we could generate that.
Okay, that'd be great. I'll give you my information.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. We also do have a number of large drainage projects going on in Florida, which would have the effect of helping in these areas as well. We are seeing a lot more wildfire mitigation projects. We consult with our tribal partners to see if they have any concerns about potential archaeological remains that may be affected. So we go through usually a 45-day consultation period when we have those proposed plans, and then before we approve them. And during that time, we look at what concerns may be there from a cultural standpoint as well as a historic standpoint.
So basically, it's a mini hurricane shelter for a historic neighborhood?
Yes, and it doesn't have to be historic, it's any community, yep. And it would, the size depends on the population of the area, so it could be that it is available to serve 75 people, 250 people, depending on the needs of the community.
Thank you. District where a portion of the people wish to get rid of the historic designation because they believe it will save them. They're not in that kind of danger, but that's what they're in. We think it could be more than just that. It could be because we have single-family homes and they'd like to build here. So have you heard about this kind of thing and around your travels?
Yeah, when I previously worked for a nonprofit in Georgia, the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, and we went throughout the state and to really encourage historic districts and historic designations because we see the benefit that that provides. As far as it can make tax credits available to structures, and it can help protect communities. I think the commissioner mentioned the essence that makes up the community. The reason why people want to travel and see those communities often is because of the heritage that's there and the historic districts that they go to see. So it's something that we're big proponents of, and with my work at FEMA, one of those standard treatment measures that we look to is to identify other resources so that we can hopefully provide some protection to those neighborhoods if we do have to have an effect on another historic property. So unfortunately, I haven't been in a position to deal with a district that wants to be unlisted or desires to have their historic designation taken away, though it's certainly something that presents an issue with communities, and I think when we're looking at that from just a preservation standpoint, the best defense is to try to explain any kind of incentives that may be available locally or nationally through the historic tax credit program, which really could be the best incentives that are offered. So that's available, but that's a really tricky situation.
I really wondered if it's become a national kind of thing where people are worried, so they jump right on.
I personally haven't seen a trend in that way, but I can understand why certain communities would be facing that problem. Yes, sir?
Question. I live on Alton Road. Main house is 1939 with a 1955 addition. Are there FEMA grants for a private home to get raised up to like a PFE?
There can be. And the way that it works is that the individual homeowner would go through the local municipality. So it may be that the city applies to the state for FEMA funding, and then the state would receive funding, and it's generally one property or a number of properties that have a history of flooding. And the state would then apply to FEMA for funding. FEMA would review that and can provide a grant to the state state then passes that to the local city or county, whoever is municipality, and then they work directly with the homeowner. So it's not a direct line from FEMA to the homeowner, but there are programs that exist so that residential properties can receive grant funding.
I've been in the house over 50 years, and we've never had a flood.
Yeah. That would make it difficult then, yeah, because those programs are primarily for residents that have experienced flooding or repetitive